So, where am I going to start with? I just thought, thank you for such a great evening, lovely talk. You mentioned about Lyons and Israel seeing potential in Tom. What made Tom give up good teaching job up in Newcastle and come down to work in London?
Well, first of all, he wanted to be in London. Who doesn't? Actually, Charles, you probably know.
He'd met them actually.
I'm seeing the family like this now.
He'd met them actually before the war.
Yes.
And they'd lent him money.
Oh, that was it.
So, and they said, well, when you can afford to pay it back, come and see us. So when he came back down from Newcastle and Durham, he said, here's the money. What about a job? And
but I think he'd respected their work beforehand. I mean, he'd known them and he'd seen the scholarship that they represented. Yep. And they'd also had a joint interest in the work of Gunnar Asplund and the Scandinavian Nordic modernists and classicists. So I think there was an overlap.
At that time, they were also, Lawrence and Edward were in partnership with Cecil Elson. And he was leaving.
Yes.
And there was a gap.
Yeah.
But he used to drive round in his Bentley at lunchtime and say, would you like to come to lunch? And they would. Because I think he missed them.
Yeah.
So...
Yeah, I think that's the thing. You've got this sort of really quite traditional practice. They'd all worked for Mrs. Joseph, hadn't they, while studying here part-time. And you've got that old sort of, bright Jewish lads being brought on and then going on to do their own thing in a very different way from how the post-war practice developed under Tom. So shall we bring Tuffa John in and how you got involved?
I had my problems to that.
Yeah.
I think Cecil Elson was rather important to the connection between Tom Ellis and Lyons Israel, because Elson was a partner with Lyons and Israel pre-war, and latterly, in the post-war period, he met Tom and was able to recommend to Tom that he should go and work with Lyons and Israel.
And then, I mean, it's a bit, it's always sort of, there's this practice that's like who's who of your generation. Did you and Neave and Alan and everybody get headhunted?
In my case, I was an A student. I'd finished, I think, in 1956. I took a job in Bedford Square working for an architect who specialised in two-way mirrors for rather cheap supermarkets. Yeah. And it didn't work out. Either way, they didn't care for me and I didn't care for what I was doing, so we agreed to depart. And I then went through a period of, I suppose you could say, recreational cinema visiting, which went on for several months. And then, quite by chance, I was walking up, what's the name of the
Gowan Street.
Gowan Street, yeah. Thank you, John.
You told me at lunchtime.
I had this problem all the time with names and things. Gowan Street, and who should be coming from across the square, Bedford Square, was Peter Smithson, my old year master. And Peter said, what are you doing? So I said, not an awful lot, if you want to know. So he said, you should get a good job. So I said, of course, but I don't know where to go. There was no method that the schools had in those days to encourage you to find jobs. And so he said, have you heard of Lyons Israel? And Ellis, I think. LIEG, yes, that's right. And I said, never heard of them. So he said, well, it's a good practice. You should try them. I'll speak to them. And you then ring up on whatever day it was and make a date to go and see them. So I did. And I went, and I brought my portfolio. And the next minute, I was told to show up on a Monday and start work. And there I was. And I stayed there for 2 happy years.
And what was it like? You mentioned, I think, this large back office. Describe working there for me.
I mean, so it was a surprise because I was shown into my corner perch with its black cloth over the drawing board and this old-fashioned T-square stuck on one side, because ruler lines, the kind of more sophisticated version, hadn't been invented yet, or at least they hadn't got round to Lyons Israel. And I was given a brief, and I'm told what I'd be working on, which was working on Kenray School with Edward Lyons. And I realized that this was quite different from what the A was like, where we were all on first name terms with the staff. Because here, everybody, we to the partners and the partners to us, were Mr. this, Mr. that, and the other, you know. So I was Mr. Miller, and he was Mr. Lyons. And the exception to this was Tom Ellis, because he obviously didn't like the implied hierarchy. And as a consequence, he used to sort of fumble with the address, and you realize what he was trying to tell you, that he wanted to call you John, and you were in turn to call him Tom, which you did after hours, but not during studio time. And what else? I soon discovered that the experience of drawing was totally different from what I expected. We drew on this heavy detail paper, which was white, rather, I thought, inhospitable material, but however, it was something which they all used, and we used pencil, 4H pencils, and if you made an error, you had to sort of rub away quite severely to get rid of the line. No ink at all. But gradually, the rebels, myself and Neave Brown and David Gray, introduced ink imperceptibly on the drawing. So there was a kind of revolutionary spirit taking place in the drafting room. And gradually one noticed that the old hands, all these guys who wore their white coats and their pens in their pockets and were so proficient in building construction, and had all ended up at Lyons Israel after apprenticeships of various kinds, and had been there for a long, long time, and knew building construction backwards. And you found that the slight fudder that existed when we went there, it cooled, or warmed, let's say, sorry, it warmed. That's better. And we found we had things in common. We could give them and they could give us. It was very good, a successful process, I think. And one learned one's trade a little bit, or began to learn the trade, which at the AA, of course, was always concerned with the concept and not trade, and construction, and the love of making things became important. I think it's about
So how big was this? How big was this sort of the technical, old technical staff versus you infiltrators? How was the balance in terms of numbers?
Oh, initially it was only me, and then there was Neave, and then there was David. So, and the rest of them was, I think, I can recite all the names actually still, I think. Some of them, Paul Jakob, who I became a very close friend of, he'd been there already 4, 5, 6 years, something like that, and was very, very favoured assistant of Lyons. Mr. Jakob, I want to talk to you. Something very important has arisen. Please come and so. You know. Is it working?
In the center, yeah, yes.
Oh, sorry, I'm very bad about this.
That's there.
Okay. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Could you hear me before? Yeah. Oh, that's all right, then, isn't it?
Luckily, it's a good space, but I think it does help.
So, I was, I think, very, very fortunate because it was that the golden period, I think, the welfare state, the wind was in our sails.
And now, James Stirling and James Gowan had passed through before you.
Yes.
So I wondered how whether they'd sort of disturbed the atmosphere before you got there.
I don't know that they did actually, because they were in the basement, and they had their own kind of setup somewhat. But there were sort of signs. I mean, for instance, I think Peckham School, one of the London schools, has a gym water tower. I think I'm right in saying that Jim did, and somehow he got it through the scrutiny of the partners, and there it is. So I mean, there was a kind of rebellious bit, I suppose, downstairs, but it didn't have the same effect upstairs where we were in the drafting room, where the action was. You know.
The office was never larger. The office is never larger than about 20 people.
That's right.
Yeah, so it was always this fairly small, compact office. And Lyons Israel managed the firm, and he did it in the most meticulous way. He had little notebooks, and every aspect of the firm's business was in these notebooks. All the fees coming in, the salaries going out. He knew whether they were in the red or in the black. Yeah. So he didn't need managers. He just had, as he said, good assistants, and he kept it all in his own little notebooks. And that was a remarkable achievement on his part.
I've got a further comment on his notebooks. It's certainly true that, I mean, we all knew about his notebook, a little thing like this that came out of his pocket. But going to the old Vic building site with Israel was an extraordinary experience, apart from the difficulty of sharing an umbrella with him down Portland Place, and then getting to Oxford Street Station and on to Waterloo. There was the arrival at the site, and the builders and the engineers and the subcontractors were all in a group. And Izzy and I would walk across, out would come a notebook and a blank page, and he would start asking questions of the contractors, and they would give answers, and he would remark on something should be done about so-and-so, etc., which is on the drawings and so on. And then a promenade took place, and that was it. And so you think, a site meeting? Where's the hut? There's no hut. There's no kind of conversation. The thing is that the contractors, that particular contractor anyway, respected Lyons Israel Ellis's know-how as builders, and therefore they never queried any of their construction. They knew exactly what to do, and as a consequence, it was a lesson which, unfortunately, in the future, Alan and I, when we were in partnership together, never discovered. I mean, we never had that kind of relationship with the contractors that Lyons Israel and Ellis had, which was remarkable. Everything was kept in one of these little books. The whole story of the contract.
But strangely enough, they also had that relationship with other architects, builders. When Tom was working on a project in Cambridge, you'd go along to the history faculty and talk to the builder there of all his problems that he was having with Jim's.
The library.
And solving them for him.
Yeah. Jim never knew that.
Yes.
Well, I thought he did find out, didn't
I
he?
think he found out eventually. Yeah.
And he was quite pleased.
He was delighted. Yes.
Yes.
So but that all seems to make the actual architecture the more striking, because there's nothing simple or traditional about what you were designing. How did that relationship bear out?
Well, I have this theory anyway, which John mentioned in his talk, that Tom Ellis's experience of building hospitals in Cairo using concrete frame construction and prefabrication and standardized pieces, which was a kind of background knowledge that he brought back to London after the war was over. And the two partners realized that things had moved on since their days in 1936, 37, 38, and so on. And the new building requirements really matched Tom's knowledge, and I think it was very influential in the office, actually, in a quiet and modest way. It was one of Tom's qualities, I think, his modest intrusion and able to move things in a certain direction. I liked.
How did it seems from what you're saying that the partners in Lyons Israel allowed a degree of design input by their assistants. Was that explicit or was it implicit?
That's a good question. It's, I think, implicit rather than explicit. It depended, actually, on situation and circumstance. I mean, after the Old Vic was completed, I'd been allowed a certain amount of liberty doing some detailed design on the kind of more hidden parts of the building, which I enjoy, sort of changing things without telling anybody. But Tom used to make visits and check and gave me the thumbs up. But then, following that, the most unlikely thing happened. There was a school extension for Harrow Weald Grammar School, and Tom asked me to take it home and design it at home in the evenings and then come in and have a conversation with him. And it was built, finally, just after I left, unfortunately. So I didn't see the completion.
Why did you do that?
Why did you do it? I don't know why. I think he had a hope that the office would evolve into a more liberal kind of relationship between assistants and partners. I think that was the case. Would you say?
I think that's true, yes.
Yes, I think there was also, where they got their work from, a lot of it was the loyalty of, let's say, the staff sergeants that Tom worked with in Cairo, came back to the UK and were working then in local authorities, and they would ring up and say, "We've got some work. Would you care to do it?"
That's amazing. No, I didn't know that.
Because they'd won the Triscobius, however you pronounce it, was a competition. And I suppose that gives them the imprimatur that other counties would then come calling too, wouldn't it?
The connections were, there was actually somebody that Edward Lyons had been in the Royal Engineers with down in Kent, and that was the Herne Bay connection. Tom's connections were in Shropshire, Cheshire and Lancashire.
Yeah.
And there was sort of half a dozen schools up there that the connection was made. But I think the Orpington School, Herne Bay, and
then the ones down in Southampton.
yes, and I don't know who had the connection with the Sheffield and Yorkshire schools.
I don't know.
But they just morphed into one another.
Did any of the pre-war clients for the town halls have any influence, you suppose, later? I often wonder
That's an
about
interesting
this.
question, because they'd won a number of competitions for town halls before the war, none of which got built, unfortunately. Potter's Bar, Finchley, Harrow, that's right. And they were in sort of a Nordic classicist style. And they were also, I think, the runners-up for the TUC building on Great Russell Street, just around the corner from the AA. So they had a high profile in the pre-war years, these two young guys. They were in their late 30s, and here they were winning competitions. And John, you told a story about one of their clients.
I get this right, but they had a habit of getting first prizes and second prizes and so on. And the assessors seem to be the same kind of group on each of these competitions for the town halls. And on one occasion, the assessor comes up to Lyons Israel and says, we recognize your project from the drawings, and we thought you'd had far enough first prizes, so we decided to give you a second prize this time. I can't imagine that happening now, I don't think.
Would hope not. Are there questions from out here?
I often wonder why this. Sorry. I'll shut up.
Yeah, we can hear you.
No, I often wonder why the synagogue in Chalk Farm is never published.
I don't know.
I don't know.
Which
Charles?
I think was an Israel job, wasn't it?
Yes.
No, Lyons.
It wasn't Lyons.
Lions job.
Okay.
Very much Lions, yes.
Because it was quite an interesting building. I mean, we got involved in doing things to it, which in fact never happened. In fact, I think Allies and Morrison have. It's not been pulled down, has it? But it's been changed.
No, it's pulled down.
It's been pulled down.
It, unfortunately, is the only time they ever used high alumina cement,
Yeah.
and the roof was dodgy. But Lawrence was a keen cricketer and played.
Mike, could you?
He was a keen cricketer and he was a member of Lords. And I remember he took the rabbis from the Liberal synagogue to a match. And then, unfortunately, he came into the office and he said to Tom, I don't know why I did it, but I said, at lunchtime, why don't we go down and have a bacon sandwich? Never got another job.
Lyons was well connected with Southampton, wasn't he? He did all the Southampton housing.
Yes, the Southampton housing projects, the Wyndham Court projects, and several schools down there. So that was his area, and catering college at Poole. Yeah.
So, but I'm thinking Wyndham Court and thinking, so I'm going to shout, it's easier. That there did the assistants have more of a hand, because Wyndham, the buildings, and particularly Wyndham Court, seemed very brutal and modern and everything, but Lyons wasn't. And that seems a very extreme example for something that was top down, and it feels bottom up, and I just wondered how that worked.
I don't know enough about that project, I'm afraid, but you're right. It's a radical change from their post-war work, which was Festival of Britain, and completely different from their pre-war work. So clearly they'd embraced a brutalist aesthetic and pouring concrete construction system throughout, and it was an evolution, I think, over time, and it's one, I think, that was influenced by people in the office.
Yeah, I just wondered if John if you saw any of this evolution happening with the housing and other jobs in the office.
Oh gosh, I can't say. I don't know. I'm troubled by this word brutalism, actually. It seems to me to cover so much, and it's so imprecise. But the the building that I worked on owes, I think, most to the constructional technique of work like the shower housing of Corbusier. But I wouldn't call that brutalist particularly. I mean, I think the ungirt concrete got this reputation for being brutalist, but I think if you were to talk to the Peter Smithson or Alison Smithson particularly, she would give you a very different interpretation of what brutalism meant. It was much more to do with the exposure of all the works of a building, its pipework, its conduits, the apparatus of the building, as it were, as much as it was the framework and so on.
But there was about 5 years in which there were a lot of completely concrete buildings. The Middleton Town Hall, the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, Hackney, the Commonwealth building at Hammersmith Hospital as well, and the Wyndham Court. And it was, I think, a phase of about where they'd taken the opportunity to actually explore the material, and they used it over and over again. And I think, but they came out of it, yes. And that the buildings like the College of Engineering Science here and other things at the late stage were very much going away from concrete as the sole material.
Yes.
Yes.
Actually, on the question of concrete, I mean, you could probably correct me if I'm wrong, but I have a recollection that Tom discovered that you could get white sand or white material for concrete in Cornwall, in the China clay.
It was the China clay people.
China clay people. Yeah. And that was a revolutionary moment for him, actually. You know.
And then unfortunately, I think the China clay people saw that this was going to be, where previously it had been just something they wanted to get rid of,
yeah.
And you got it for nothing, because it was a waste material as far as they were concerned. And then the moment, of course, it had a value, transportation from Cornwall was a little bit more of a problem, as if they wanted to be putting a profit on it, rather than virtually paying architects to take it away.
Amazing.
But actually, there's an interesting story about Tom and concrete. He used to like to go to Italy every summer for a vacation, and he would stop off on several occasions in Milan and meet with Riccardo Morandi, who introduced him as Il Professore Gemente Bianco. And he gave actually Tom a book of his work, and it's inscribed, Friendly Morandi.
I was just thinking that the work is very rationalist, and that because there were 4 of them in the practice, it seems like very sort of that could be one of the reasons why it's so ordered, and the detailing is quite sort of pared down, etc. And I was just wondering, like, how they would have reacted when Corbusier did Ronchamp and then went into this kind of more irrational kind of architecture, and whether they, because they didn't kind of have that European sort of thing of having something slightly different and irrational going on there at all. I mean, maybe I'm misunderstanding it, but
I think you're right. They admired Corb immensely, although actually Tom never wanted to meet Corb, because they thought that if he did meet him, he wouldn't like him. And I think John Miller maybe can testify to that, because he did meet Corb, yes, and found him rather cold. But they were interested in Corb's post-war work, Ronchamp, not Ronchamp, La Tourette, Saint-Dié, the Marseille buildings, the Joule houses, as well as the planning of the pre-war work. And actually, Tom wrote quite an important article to architectural design called The Discipline of the Route, where he analyzed Corb's planning and Corb's circulation, the architectural promenade through the building, and explained it in a very, very interesting way. And that article actually, several people have asked for it to be republished. And I'm working actually right now with Elain on a book in their series 20th Century Architects on the firm's work. And one of the chapters we're going to put in is a reprint of the Discipline of the Root article.
But I also think that actually by the early 60s, Corb didn't lose his importance, but Alvar Aalto was playing a very much stronger role in... Tom was very interested in his planning, yes, and the way that those small town halls that Aalto was doing in Finland fascinated him. And I think what when he was invited over to receive his gold medal, they actually shared a table together and spent the last sort of hour after the ceremony drawing on a white tablecloth, which you've got in your...
Yes.
Sort of.
Actually, it was an interesting... Tom was one of the speakers at the RIBA gold medal ceremony. And he spoke very knowledgeably about Aalto's work. And Aalto said to him, "It's such a pleasure to meet somebody who really has been to my buildings and really knows them." Tom had never seen any of them. He just studied the plans.
So that would have been 57?
57, that's right.
And so how did David Gray become a partner? Because he's your generation, isn't he?
How did he become a partner?
I think it's when Edward Lyons retired. Yes.
I mean, all the rest of you got out and he stayed, I suppose, is the question.
Gather my thoughts about this. What happened? Lyons was, I thought, always rather difficult to know. He was a more solitary person, but he liked having an assistant that he trusted and could hit the ball back over the net, as it were. And David had this incredible patience and would receive a suggestion from Lyons, particularly for one particular building, Barnsley College of Technology, yes, and made sort of suggestions for it. And one noticed in the office during this period, David became more and more important to Lyons, and he was involved much more closely all the time on this project, and maybe on other ones as well, I don't know. But and it seemed that it was inevitable, actually, that through this relationship that they had, these two, that he would eventually fetch up with a partnership. I think, but I may be wrong.
I think that's right.
There was a question up there. How am I going to... Do you want to do the honours?
I'm getting dry.
Thank you. I'd love to know more about this building. It seems like it's a great synthesis of a lot of their previous work, and it has moments of the flair of maybe influence from Stirling's work in Leicester. But it's also a building of incredible economy, and I just wonder how important it was, this commission, to the practice at that time.
Yes. No, it was a crucial building. I mean, this was, I think, Tom's favourite building that he ever did, the one he put the most love into. And you're right, it built upon work done previously. It clearly learnt from the Wolfson Institute, the lecture theatres, because the same idea in terms of the shape and the profile and the acoustical aspects was incorporated in these. But also I think it was influenced by other buildings such as the Van Nelle tobacco factory building in Rotterdam, with its uniform glazing, which actually my wife and I just visited only a few weeks ago, and it's a magnificent building. That way of unifying a very complicated composition of these different components, you know, the staggered block of the lab building over to Cleveland Street, the stepped section of the building down Cavendish Street, and then this great knot of complex pieces, sculptural pieces in the middle, which represent the heart of the campus. The places where people meet, where lectures take place, where the library is. On the ground floor was the dining facility, and it was the hub of the building, and it had these dramatic 3-story high spaces that you could look from one level down to another, and it was all tied together. Tom was really fascinated with that, and it clearly had references to other sources, like Stirling's building in Leicester and Melnikoff's Tram Workers Club, just in terms of the shapes of the auditorium. So there were a lot of interesting influences in that, and he really absolutely enjoyed the whole design process of pushing this one through.
Did Kahn become an influence?
Well, just the idea of servant and served spaces, clearly that was a very important reference here. And you, as you can see, with all the staircase towers are identified in their white concrete form, and then the tops of them containing all the mechanical equipment with the hoods that come out. So that told a story about what the building was doing. And I think one of the things about their architecture was it was very explicit. The plans revealed what was happening, whether it was the water tower in the school in Hull, which had to be at a certain height to get pressure, but it was treated as a sculptural element, or the structural frame pattern that one saw in the Bridgnorth School that Alan Colquhoun worked on, or the aspects of the Old Vic building, you know, in terms of the profile of the sheds for the scenery studios and things like that. Their buildings were very honest. They told a story about what they were doing, how they were built, how they were constructed, what all the different parts were. There was no facade in front and hidden stuff behind.
That does get you back to what John was saying about Alison and wanting things exposed, in a way, doesn't it?
Yes, I guess she wouldn't have wanted any false ceilings here.
No.
Was there a discussion between partners about the development of their architectural manner, or were they individual?
Well, that's a good question. I think Edward Lyons and David Gray went in one direction, and Lawrence and Tom in another. I mean, of the 4 partners, Edward and David worked together, and Lawrence and Tom worked together. There was an overlap, but you could identify who did which buildings.
Lawrence tended not to verbalise, I think, a lot. He used his drawings as a way of communication. I can't remember Tom ever actually having deep or long conversations with his partners about anything, but they would talk, and then somehow or other sketches would emerge from their 10-inch rolls, and they would be they'd look at them, absorb it, and then go away and have another iteration. But I can't remember actually them ever talking. Tom used to talk to the associates and the juniors very much more.
Yes, I mean,
babies rather than actually any conversation with his partners.
After work, at least twice a week, Tom would come into the drafting room and say, would you like to come and have a cup of coffee? And so he would very often bring with him a piece of a drawing of the Old Vic floor plan or something like that. And Alan and Tom and I would then walk into Marylebone High Street to the Cardoma Coffee Club, coffee bar, and proceed to kind of discuss the building. And then we talk about his favourite subject, which, funny enough, hasn't come up during this evening at all, I don't think. And that is Tom's theory about the discipline of the root, which was a favourite topic. It was a kind of a simplified version, I think, of the architectural promenade, or promenade architectural, pardon, and of Corbusier, you know, and how you move through spaces and so on. Tom had this very kind of simple idea that you really had to have a very clear processional route through the building, entry and then finally exit, picking up the major spaces en route. And we had a lot of discussions about that, Alan and I, and he, and Olmec, and many other subjects as well related to it, which was very enjoyable, actually, a way of kind of having another kind of degree of intimacy, which was missing in the office, in fact. I think that's it, really. I think what I want to ask you, John, yes, and that is, what is the story about the 4-foot module, which is present in most of the school buildings, and why did they suddenly, in this building, with its elegant bronze glazing, slip down to 2-foot module, which I think is much more elegant than the 4-foot one. But I'd just like to know why.
Well, I think the 2-foot module just lent itself to all the compartmentalization of all the plan. Every partition was either at 2-foot centers, 10-foot wide rooms, 12-foot wide rooms, 16-foot wide rooms. The 2-foot module was flexible enough to allow any partition to be located on a glazing bar.
You could have done that on the other jobs, couldn't you? 2-foot would have worked just as well.
Yes, although I think they liked the proportions of the windows in the other projects. I mean, if you look, for example, at the Hull School, the windows are beautifully proportioned in terms of squares and golden sections. And it's tragic, the way that building was, before it was demolished, they just put in the most banal, window pattern you could imagine. But the design of the fenestration patterns on all their projects was very, very carefully thought through in terms of proportion and regulating lines. And it was straight out of, Corb and Renaissance planning.
But there was also, rather more banal, it was one of the few Section 20 buildings that he was associated with. And there the regulations about smoke ventilation in every room was lent itself to a 2-foot module. And there you would also, talking about the fenestration here, was that one of the contradictions of, Tom always found with the solar gain and the very high windows was because at the time the education code of practice was that the backs of any teaching space should have 50% of the daylight that it should have by the window, so that there are these enormously overlit spaces with massive solar gain.
Yeah.
But they didn't, although they were keen students of Le Corbusier, it seems from what's being said here that they didn't read Corbusier's writings. They actually looked at his architecture and reprocessed it. Is that right?
I don't think Tom ever read any of Corb's writings, and he always thought, as an urban designer, he was an idiot. But
you thought Corbusier was an idiot?
No, Corb's city planning. Yeah. But he loved the quality and the craftsmanship of his architecture, and he recognized, I think, how scholarly Corb was in terms of his knowledge of Renaissance planning and classical architecture. I mean, that enabled Corb to define beautifully planned and proportioned buildings and elevations and sections. And I think those are the things that he really admired.
Well, it's interesting in relation to the way that architects often perform now, where there's a demand or a tendency for rhetoric to accompany.
Yes.
And last night I gave a lecture on Leverance, and what you learn from Leverance is that he never said anything about his buildings. He drew on vernacular Swedish buildings, which he didn't share with anybody. He worked directly in architecture, directly in the materials of architecture, in the way that, let's say, a painter might work directly in the, or a sculptor might work directly in the material that they had at hand. And that's what I'm seeing from this discussion.
Yes. I think
they took Corbusier's formalisms and architectural possibilities, and they transformed them into a workable vocabulary for the kind of work that they had to do.
Yes. And every time a new volume of Corb's work came out, Tom would really study it in the most scholarly way. I mean, he'd take the volume backwards and forwards on the train to and from work, and he would study every plan. And he was fascinated in the evolution of a plan, and he would ask himself, why did Corb make this change? You know, look, for example, at the Villa Savoie, the original plan and the ultimate plan. And, for example, in the early plans, there's a staircase next to the main ramp, and the staircase faces you as you enter the building. And eventually, Corb turned that round backwards. And Tom realized he did that deliberately in order to give greater emphasis to the ramp. Otherwise, everyone would use the shortcut of the staircase, and the ramp would be redundant. So he was looking at the thinking behind these plans with great skill and care.
A scholar to the extent that he was, at least once a fortnight, he would visit Alec Tarantes in Charlotte Street or Sveno's, and sort of spend the entire lunch hour poring through the latest either magazines or sort of Oeuvre Complète or whatever it is that was coming in. So he wasn't just Corb, he was actually looking at any sort of architectural publications.
Yes.
He wouldn't buy very many of them, but he was a regular browser of sort of architectural publications throughout his life.
And his library actually was really quite remarkable, and he had the complete works of Lutyens. We've inherited between us his alto books, his Asplund books, his Corb books, his Neutra books, Lucan books. Yeah, they're all there. And we're adding to them ourselves.
I guess the last sort of question from me. How much time were you dragged into the office as kids? How did you two get hooked?
Well, let's see. I think I had architectural yearnings around about age 6. I remember seeing how beautifully Tom drew. Because he came home in the evenings and he would have a drawing board and he propped up on bricks, you know, the way they used to be. His drawing board was propped up on bricks, remember? Right. Yes. And I was just admired the accuracy with which he drew. And also his perspectives. He did very quick, sketchy perspectives using actually lots of spit to get the effect, you know, ink and spit. And then on the way home on the Underground, his copy of the Evening Standard would always be filled with little sketch drawings. So I was really intrigued with that, and I just think from an early age I always thought, I want to do that too.
Well, I went to, I think the first time I went to when their office was actually in Seymour Street, 19 Seymour Street, which was mid-50s, late 50s. And I fell in love with the secretary. I thought, I want to work here.
Can I at this moment say that nominally as chair of this, that we might draw to a close, unless there are other questions?
I just thought, since Christopher Dean...
Shout into the microphone.
I can bring it up to you if you want.
It's too far away. No.
Since this is a Docomomo event and Christopher Dean set up Docomomo and was sort of co-founder of the whole thing really internationally, and he was one of the names who's cropped up. I only knew him, you know, from when he set up Docomomo, but I'm always intrigued to hear about what his activities had been like before. Of course, he went on to become partner of Castle Park, Dean and Hook, but I didn't know until today, quite literally, that he'd been worked in for Lyons Israel Ellis before that. I mean, just apparently on the old Vic building. But any reminiscences, any stories, how did he fit into that sort of?
Do you know stories about Christopher Dean? You remember him?
Of course I remember Christopher.
I think this will be the last question.
How appropriate.
Any stories about Christopher Dean? Christopher was one of the earlier products of a school of architecture. I'm not sure which one he came from, and it had been assimilated already into the drafting pool, and became quite technically proficient at doing the stuff. And he was very inventive, I remember, with some of the detailing that was required, and impressive in the way he coped with it all. And there weren't many jokes in the office, as it were, actually. But Christopher was very good on inventing a kind of bit of mischief every so often, which I thought lifted the spirits of it, you know. The rubber bands flying across the room, you know, suddenly, and things like this, which was sort of surprising in some ways. But I don't remember anything particular about him, except he did do the staircase on the end of the old Vic extension, the annex, yes. The escape staircase, that was Christopher's gift to the building.
Thank you.
But he was great fun. I liked him a lot. He was a good friend.
I remember there was some discussion about Christopher Dean. He used to go for weekends in Paris, and he'd come back exhausted. And I think there was some discussion about how many packets of contraceptives he should be allowed to take with him. But maybe that scares.
That's a lovely way to end an architectural evening.
I think when it descends to this kind of story, it should be the end of the event. Thank you all.